Good afternoon. My name is Romana Manzoor, and I am the program coordinator here at American Islamic College. On behalf of President Dr. Ali Yurtsever and AIC, I would like to give you all a very warm welcome. We are very happy to be a part of such an incredible symposium dedicated to Professor John Hunwick of Northwestern, the pioneer and world-renowned scholar on Islam in Africa. It is an honor to host you, our distinguished panelists, scholars, and guests. For those of you who are not familiar with AIC, AIC is a liberal arts college with an Islamic orientation. We offer 3 degree programs, a Bachelor of Arts in Islamic Studies, which also has the general education component, the Master of Arts in Islamic Studies. There are 2 concentrations, Islamic Theology and Islam and Global Studies. And then finally, the Master of Divinity in Islamic Studies, also known as the Islamic Chaplaincy Program, which is the first of its kind in the United States. It's really a great institution to be a part of. There's a short video I would like to show you that kind of captures what we're trying to do here at AIC. So if you could kindly turn your attention to the screen.
We like the fact that American Islamic College as a space is a sort of catalyst for many questions.
Why do people act like that? How is this different from what I hear in the media? What are people doing? Are they all the same or different? Is it homogeneous? Is it heterogeneous? And that's beautiful because it brings an awareness.
It's at the interface of Islamic values of knowledge and contemporary knowledge and methodologies themselves.
American Islamic College was founded in 1981 with the intention of educating the students and the community about Islam, Muslims, and building bridges between the Islamic countries, Muslims, and non-Muslims.
It's more than just something personal. It's something that, has a lot of social benefit. You always think it's just a religion. Little do we know that it's a civilization.
Here, you'll get a fuller range of Islamic studies courses because that is the sole focus of our program here. That we bring a diverse array of specialties within Islamic studies to the table.
We're really seeking to pursue all of these branches of knowledge and all of these branches of learning in a way that awakens the conversation that they're having with one another.
I'm from Turkey and I can bring my own story. So by sharing stories in the classroom environment, we are learning a lot from each other.
As a civil rights activist and as a frequent media commentator, I'm often met with the problem of who speaks for Muslims in Islam.
We'll be really exploring all these issues, Islamic thought related to gender, related to race, related to conflict, related to war.
They don't give you one particular angle or perspective concerning Islam. Islam is so vast and it's so diverse, and it encompasses so many aspects that they don't just give you one narrative.
We definitely need at this point academic programs such as the Masters of Divinity offered here at AIC.
Divinity is the right word because that's the word that signals this kind of holistic, formation-oriented education.
These are courses that are very hands-on. Our instructors feel very strongly about the one-on-one attention that we give to our students.
Oh, it is great. It's definitely like a family. People are close. Right off the bat, you feel like you're welcomed.
At American Islamic College, we are very open to the community. Our facilities are frequently used by outside organizations.
We love Chicago. Chicago is also a diverse city, and we are receiving many people from different communities here, regardless of their faith, color, background, race.
It's a beautiful small campus within the big city. It's nice by the lake. It really has a very beautiful old-style building.
And the education institution must be continuous, and also not only the students but also the community must be educated.
I learn every semester something new from my students.
It's a liberal arts college with a grounding in American Islam.
I absolutely would recommend this program to friends and family and to other students as well.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your attention. So if you have any more questions about the college, we have a table right outside of this auditorium that has some promotional materials. We can also discuss more about the degree programs and classes that we offer here at our reception that will take place in the dormitory building at 5 o'clock right after this symposium. So now I'd like to invite Dr. Charles Stewart, the convener of the symposium. Thank you.
Well, on behalf of ISET, let me thank the American Islamic College for these physical arrangements. I'd explained to Ramona that we've been cramped in a small space for the last day and a half. Here is a chance for us to enjoy ourselves and spread out. We appreciate this very much. This last panel had been sort of set aside for this space. And it is on the second half of the Transmitting Knowledge, Finding Meanings set of presentations, this one focusing on the Holy Quran. Maimouna Barrow is going to chair, and Jawad Qureshi from the American Islamic College will be the discussant. Why don't we assemble?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you everybody for coming all the way to the American College, Islamic College. Thank you to the Islamic College for the warm welcome. I am Maimouna Barrow. I'm Associate Director at the Center for African Studies. Well, first of all, I think I want to thank Rebecca and Professor Stewart for working together so well with the University of Illinois. I have to say that Professor Stewart is a mentor. And I am really sorry that I was a disappointment because I should have been here talking about maybe women and Islam in West Africa. He tried his best, but I kind of chose a different path. I'm still dealing with issues that have to do with women and education in West Africa, and it's really a pleasure, it's an honor to actually be here with still him as a mentor. So thank you for everything. And so today we are honored to be here for the last panel on reading the Quran. So we've been talking about how to deal with texts. And yesterday, if I just can go back to things I've heard, like from elevation to sanctity. For me, really, from working with this group at Northwestern on even coming up with a concept paper for our proposal, because this is a Title VI funded project. We also have to mention the US Department of Education in many ways for supporting this project that we are doing with the Northwestern University. And so from the concept paper to now, I've been feeling really elevated. So I can see now that this is the peak of that elevation. Being given the opportunity to actually be here and chair this session is a great honor. So thank you to the audience, thank you to the presenters. So I'm going to go and start with our first presenter. Do you have Okay. So our first presenter is Corinne Fortier. She is from the Department of Anthropology at Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique. So these are both based in Paris. And Corinne will be presenting on power and embodiment of Quranic sacred words. So Corinne, you have about 20 minutes, and then we'll move to the next presenter. And then we should have enough time for the discussant before we open it up to the audience for questions and comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Maimouna. So first I would like to thank Charles Stewart for his warm welcome here. I'm very glad to be there, and for the organization of this symposium. And also Rebecca, also for her kindness and efficacy in the organization. Alors, I didn't know John Henwick. I was very touched by the testimony of the people who know him yesterday. And well, I know his works, but I know also his personality, because it touched me a lot yesterday, the ceremony. So my presentation is, so first also I would like to apologize, I don't have PowerPoint, and I have a strong French accent, but I hope you could understand me. So the title of my presentation is Power and Embodiment of Quranic Sacred Words, so which is related to the title of the symposium, so about sacred words. So the analysis of Quranic education in Mauritanian Moorish societies calls into question more generally about the nature of the transmission of the Quran. The writing board, the fundamental element in Quranic learning, is a thin rectangular plank of wood whose upper angles have been rounded off. On one hand, this board signals the interpersonal nature of transmission from master to pupil, independent of the mediation of books. On the other hand, at its movable instrument suggests, teaching may take place anywhere, provided it remains under the master's control, whether in his house or during his travels. Indeed, there is an extraordinary pedagogical unity through whose the Muslim world in teaching the Quran, as indicated by Ibn Sahnun, this Maliki jurist from Kairouan in Tunisia from the 9th century. And this unity can be read in his the Book of Rules for the Behavior of School Teachers, Kitab Adab al-Mu'allimin. Aside from corporal punishment, this instruction is constantly unbounded, and that's what I would like to show. The first phase of Quranic learning consists in its recitation, qira'ah, out loud. In Mauritania, this education, which is generally provided by the mother in Marabutic family, begins with teaching the letters of the alphabet even before the child learns to read. First of all, the child learns to distinguish different letters in terms of the number of critical points above or below the character. Second, he learns to recognize the vowel markers and the sign for doubling consonants. Once this phase is finished, the pupil will decipher the shortest surah of the Quran. As in the rest of the Muslim world, the memorization of the book begins with the first surah, Al-Fatiha, followed by the shortest surah at the end of the Quran, up to the longest surah at the beginning. The pupil learns the passage his master has written on his writing board by heart. He withdraws a bit in order to read his lesson out loud as many times as it takes to memorize it. In order to count the number of recitations it takes to memorize the text, he marks the sound with a dot for each reading, sometimes forming a triangle or rectangle of 50 dots. To facilitate study, the Quranic text is divided into 60 sections or hazab, each with its own name. The first section, named for the three mysterious initials, Alif, Lam, Mim, which open the surah, the ko, is taught last, while the last section is the first to be taught. Each of these sections is in turn divided into 8 subsections. In Mauritania, the pace of teaching is adapted to each pupil. The master is the only person authorized to judge whether a pupil can begin learning a new surah. In Mauritania, surahs are qualified as cooked or tender according to whether or not the pupil has assimilated them. Someone who has a hard head, ras gassi, the expression is Hassaniya, who compares memorization to engraving, will take more time to memorize a passage than one who has a soft head, or rasli in Hassaniya. Only after the pupil has exercised his memory and learned to read will he finally be taught to write. A much higher value is placed on reciting the Quran or tilawa than on writing it down or kitaba. Only when the pupil knows from 2 to 4 sections of the Quran by heart, he will begin to learn to write. His quill or qalam follows the trace made by the master until the teacher finally authorizes his pupil to write on his own. The most advanced pupil may also become an assistant to his master, writing verses on the writing boards of beginners and correcting their recitation. Writing is first of all executed according to the dictation of the master or his assistant. After the definitive memorization of a surah, the writing board is washed in order to be able to write other verses on it. Once the text has been copied, learned, and recite, this gesture of erasing from the writing board what one knows by heart, the Arabic expression is on the back of the heart, is the inverse of its engraving in the memory. That which is no longer written is acquired, that what is no longer objectivized is internalized. The beginning pupil drinks the water which has been used do wash the sacred text from the writing board, a treatment which underscores the oral ingestion of the Quran. According to Ibn Sahnun, there is no problem with erasing the writing board by leaking off the ink. In Mauritania, when it has not been drunk, it is poured into a place where no one will step on it irreverently, out of respect for the sacred word which has been dissolved into it. According to Ibn Sahnun, in the area of the companion of the Prophet, pupils dug a hole in the ground where they pour the water which has erased the content of the writing boards. This practice testified to the ways in which learning the Quran has been assimilated to a process of incorporation and even of ingestion. Reading and writing are ultimately subordinate to memorization and recitation, the ultimate object of Quranic instruction. The attention is given to accentuation, intonation, to the cadence of surah as uttered by the master, as well as their repetition out loud and in their rhythmic recitation, as if memory were constituted through audition. The rhythm of the torso rocking back and forth to the rhythm of Quranic verses facilitates the process of memorization. Also, all pupils are simultaneously reciting different verses. The master, like the conductor of an orchestra, is listening for any error which he signals by tapping the pupil with his rod. At a more advanced level, children answer the teacher's question by tracing the letter of the answer on the arm, leg, or hand, concealing it from the other students. If the answer is valid, the master approves, or else, or if it's not valid, he shakes his head and supplies the answer. The dominance of hearing for the transmission of knowledge explains also why a blind person, but never a deaf mute, can serve as a teacher. Even though the pupil acquires literacy by means of the Quranic text, reciting it remains more essential than reading or writing it. Moreover, this recitation should be perfect out of respect for the divine word, which is unique, final, eternal, and unchangeable. As the jurist Qayrawani, Maliki jurists recommend, you are not permitted to recite the Quran with accented rhythm as in profane singing. The majesty of God's book does not allow for any recitation other than in a serious manner and in such condition that you are sure that God will be satisfied and find it agreeable, and in bringing all your attention to bear on this pious recitation. A young man who knows the entire Quran is called Hafiz, as you know, a word designating a guardian or keeper, and which in classical Arabic alludes to the indestructible and indelible nature of the word. About the etymology of this word, I refer to the work of Jacqueline Chaby, a French Orientalist. Indeed, it is a divine work which the reciter contains within himself. His person is invested with the Quran. Carrying the Quran inside oneself also means to carry the beneficent barakah of the divine word. A hadith affirms that the carriers of the Quran are the elect of God, his close associates. Consequently, the reciter becomes an intercessor between God and other humans. The numinous character of the student invested with the divine word is used at dangerous moments of passage, such as burials. It is said on such occasions that he who knows the child who knows the entirety of the Quran has ceased wandering. In other words, that he is on the right path, the path of God. The new status of the pupil who has finished learning the Quran is made visible in Moorish society by coloring his hands and feet with henna. As soon as the henna dries, the pupil thrusts his right hand into a jar of butter. Pupils who have not finished their education lick off the butter which covers his arm in order to incorporate the divine word, which has been internalized by their comrades. It remains for the student who has, according to common practice, memorized the Quran in reverse order to take it up again, this time in the proper order. After this repetition, which generally lasts less than a year, the student acquires a new status. The termination of Quranic study is marked by a rite of passage whereby the student, over a period of 2 days, recites the entire book before his master and 2 witnesses. Before beginning his recitation, he utters a conjuration designed to protect against any error inspired by the devil. Cursed be the devil who has been stoned. The Moorish term designating the process of transmission from master to student is particularly telling. The word Isadar in Hassaniya refers to a human being or animal who, once he has satisfied his thirst at a well, continues his journey. In an ijaza, the expression used to indicate that a student holds his knowledge from a particular teacher can be approximately translated as so and so, Vlan has slaked his thirst from so and so. This formula explicitly shows that learning the Quran is conceived as a physiological process of ingestion. The student is filled with this master knowledge, and the expression assimilates the Quranic teacher to a spring from which the student so filled his knowledge. The specificity of the mode of teaching the Quran is strictly a function of the singularity of the text. The stature of this text is not comparable to that of any other scriptural reference. Called the book or Al-Kitab, it is considered by Muslims to be the very manifestation of the divine word. The Quran is conceived to be timeless and intangible, not subject to any human modification. Muslims insist on the definitive and fixed character of the Quran compared to the 2 human corrections of the Bible. The status of the Quran and the Bible are very different from an Islamic viewpoint. While the Quran is the literal word of God, the Bible is a text written by human beings, even if both are sacred books considered divinely inspired. The divine status of the text of the Quran determines the attention given to its exact memorization. It must be learned word for word in order to reproduce the Quranic discourse exactly. Moreover, its recitation must not undergo any alteration and is not permitted to ask questions while studying the Quran, which is not the case when you studied other texts like fiqh or sirah. Thus, a Muslim would prefer to abstain from citing any verse he does not know precisely, in Mauritania especially, rather than botch its recitation. This concern for exactness is not only cognitive but religious, because it testified to be respectful in a respectful faith in the word of God. The study of the transmission of Islamic knowledge raised the question of the relationship between writing and orality in the Muslim world. The mode of learning we have described testifies the importance of the memory acquired through hearing, recitation, and repetition. The primacy of orality over writing in the transmission of knowledge is confirmed by numerous practices in the intellectual and religious world of Islam. The very foundation of Islam testifies the predominance of orality over writing, given that the Quran, even before becoming the book, the kitab, was the divine word. The very name of the Quran stems from the first word revealed to the prophet, Iqra, which means recite. An injunction which is proper to a discourse that has been heard and not read. As the Quran is considered to be the expression of the divine word, appropriating it is to make the message flesh, in order that it remains indefinitely alive. This explains, on one hand, why the necessary remembrance of the divine word is a leitmotif in the Quran. I quote, for example, this verse, "Let the reminder be heard, because it is good to remember." On the other hand, it explains why learning and teaching the Quran are religiously meritorious acts. As assert a hadith, "The best among you is he who had learned the Quran and who has taught it." Uttering verses or even simple words of the Quran is in any case obligatory in all Muslim ritual, whether in prayer, where several surah are recited, for marriage, where the Fatiha is spoken aloud, or even when initiating any action by pronouncing, for example, the word Bismillah before coming in a room or before eating or whatever. Compared to the foundational text of other religions, the Quranic text is not only the fundamental reference for how to live an ethical life, but its verses are frequently uttered in accomplishing ritual practices. In addition, given the supernatural quality of the word, its knowledge confers superhuman powers on he who recites it. Unlike other forms of knowledge, Quranic knowledge is also a power. The absolute unique status of the Quran explains the singularity of its mode of transmission, for the existence in Muslim society of what I call a Quranic pedagogy, distinct from modes of learning other texts like fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, or other domains. Finally, we may conclude that the mode of transmission of learning in Islam, inversely to Western modes of transmission, subordinates writing to orality. The study of the transmission of learning in the Muslim world shows that the Muslim art of memory, which is remembrance, muzakkara, relies essentially on the sense of hearing and on oral ingestion, or orality in the full sense of the word. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Corinne. I think we probably should use this microphone so we can engage better with the public. If it's okay, can they sit down? Right? Would you rather get up or just so they can see us, okay? So let me just, now I was able to pull the biographies, so I just want to add that Corinne has conducted research in Algeria, Egypt, and Mauritania on Islamic scriptural sources related to body, gender, misfortune, and the transmission of knowledge. Okay, so now I would like to move on to the next presenter, Afis Ayinde Oladosu. He's a senior lecturer in Arabic and Islamic studies at the University of Ibadan. He specializes in Islamic literature broadly defined, with a focus on Sudanese and Egyptian fiction and poetry. He has written and published extensively on the Sudanese short story in Arabic, on the writing of Najib Mahfouz, and on the mystical dimensions of Islamic poetry. So, Afis, you also have about 20 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me begin by expressing my appreciation to the magic behind this event. Professor Charles Stewart and the indefatigable Rebecca Sherikis. You are deeply appreciated. The title of my presentation is Secret Just Like the Quran, Dalail al-Khairat of S.M. Al-Jazuli, a Muslim's experience of the sacred in West Africa. This paper attempts to fill a gap. The first is internal. Internal in the sense that most parts of West Africa have had the opportunity of working in Ghana as a visiting professor. We have clinics in places like Lome, Togo. I don't have to mention Nigeria. In an ordinary Muslim circle in West Africa. Each time an event occurs, Muslim young students in various madaris, traditional Arabic and Islamic learning centers, will be invited to read the Quran. That's usually the first step. Immediately the Quran is read, the scholar will bring Dalailul Khairat, and it will be distributed amongst those who can read the Kufic script of Dalailul Khairat. I've been involved in this for years, since, should I say, the day I was born. Now, when the call for people to this conference was sent out, the very first thing that came to my mind was to question myself. What's the origin of Dalailul Khairat? Why is it that for so long a time, we've been reading this since the day we went to Makaranta? But I never had the opportunity of questioning myself with reference to the sacredness or the profanity of what we've been reading. This conference provided the opportunity. In starting the paper, I said that the arrival of Islam to the Savannah region, West Africa, during the 8th century, like it was during the arrival of Islam to Medina, it was marked by what Barack Obama referred to as one of the prettiest sounds on earth. In other words, the day Islam arrived in Medina, the first signal to that was a call to prayer made by Bilal. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Then I argue that the very first sign to show the arrival of Islam in West Africa was the same Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. But whereas the person who called to prayer in Medina was known, the first caller to prayer in Islam in West Africa will probably remain unknown forever. However, having said that, it's my proposition that the call to prayer signaled the existence of the sacred and the awareness of the sacred in Muslim circles in West Africa. I argue with that when you say Allah Akbar, you call the prayer Allah Akbar, Allah Akbar. It's a combination of words. The word and the sacred. Muslims engage and evolve in this based on that notion that without the word, there can be no Islam. So it's my proposition that it is around this slippery terrain where ontological practice becomes a categorical imperative and where Muslims negotiate with some degree of creative afflatus that the boundaries between the word and the sacred that our excursus into the patronage of Dalai Khairat in West Africa finds justification. In other words, this paper set out to explore the trajectories in Muslims' notion and experience of the word and the sacred and how this is inscribed into the reading of Dalai Khairat. In line with Edward Said, my point of departure is a brief excursus into the history of West Africa, into the history of the advent of Islam in the region. I follow that up with questions about the word and the sacred. Let me jump that of history of Islam in West Africa to raise the following questions. The first question is with reference to why is it that the word is important in Islam and consequently for Muslims, and how does it function not only in the construction of the idea of the sacred, but equally in enriching textual practice in Muslim societies? I have 3 suggestions as response to this. The first one, quickly, is that the first argument that can be canvassed for the hallowed position of the word in Muslim culture is that it is through the word and in the word that Islamic theology and cosmogonic beliefs find representation. In other words, without the word, there will probably have been no Islam. Without the word, Muslim notions of the sacred, the mystical, and the cosmos will have been invalid. Put differently, wherever Islam is found, the pursuit of the word as sacred and the search for the sacred in the world is the nodus of religious practice. Thus, for Islam, as it is for other cultures and civilizations, all thoughts about the world has been made possible by thoughts that became words and words that in turn became the world. This is exactly what is hinted at in that Quranic verse. Yesterday, the presentation from participants from East Africa about calf. I say, if you read the Quran, there are 8 verses in the Quran that talks about the existence of the world from non-existence. One of it is Bad al-Ista'az wal-Basmala. Innama amruna. Innama amruhu idha arada shay'an an yakula lahu kun fayakun. The word kun, kaf, and nun, which occurs in 8 different places in the Quran, becomes an enigma. It becomes an enigma simply because it is from it that the world derived its existence. In other words, all pre-existence depend on the word kun for its existence. There can be no world in the absence of the word. But the reverse, Muslim theosophists and legists will argue, is equally true. All diversions from and disregard of the word are prescriptive of a world on the way to implosion and liquidation. The second response to the question I posed above, why is the word so important for the Muslim world, particularly that of West Africa, is that it is through the word, seen as a metaphysical agent, that the physical becomes possible. It is equally because in the Muslim scripture, the glorious Quran, the word is a signifier whose rich significations and invocations are beyond elucidation. In other words, the word kun It's a combination of two letters, kaf and nun. But with reference to the Quranic style, a letter can become a word. And two letters combined together can also become a word. In the beginning, contact between the word, which later became known as that of Islam, was infatuated, just as we have heard now, from that first revelation. Ikra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq. Now, I proceed from there to argue that with reference to the Quran, the very first contact with the word is with the Arabic word known as kalima, kaf, lam, mim, wata. Now, I ask myself, what are the instances in which the word has been problematized in the Quran as a prelude to my discussion of the word of the sacred in the Quran? I counted nothing less than 74 instances in which the word appeared in the Quran. Now, I argue that the geography of the word in the Islamic schema is multicultural, amongst others. Thus, we read of the word W-O-R-D in the Quran, for example, as follows, out of many others. Say, in a portion of the Quran, Allah commands the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to invite communities of faith in Medina. Say, O people of the book, come to a common word, W-O-R, ta'alaw ila kalmatin sawa'in baynana wa baynakum. That word eventually becomes a multicultural invitation to all communities of faith in Medina to come together to join hands with Muhammad in order to build that nascent Islamic community. Now, I proceed from there to raise questions about Muslims' notion of the sacred, using these discussions so far as a basis. In order to do that, I ask myself, what is the notion of the world outside Islam, quote and unquote? The above notion of the world in the social sciences, one experiences a number of challenges. The first reference point among the social scientists is always Emil Durkheim, whose notion of the sacred, for me, is slippery. He is of the opinion that there's nothing sacred. Anything that is sacred can become profane, and that which is profane can also become sacred, as has been argued yesterday. But somebody who was close to the era in which Durkheim lived, his name is James Luber, now presented a perspective from the West which finds some justification in Islam. He says, the experience of the sacred is always characterized by an element of awe, fear held in check by admiration, neutralized by curiosity, which the mysteriousness of the sacred object arouses. The sacred object has a hold upon you. We stand in dynamic relation with it. And this relation is not one of equal to equal, but of superior to inferior. Now, but I had some challenges with this again, because James is of the opinion that with some style, humanity is in a position to actually control the sacred. Then I ask myself, is this same notion possible within Islam? Using this as a basis for my discussion or analysis of Muslims' patronage of Dalai in West Africa. Then I come up with these propositions. It's my assumption that with reference to Islam, we can talk about 3 levels of the sacred. I've jumped a number of things here. While other cultures and civilizations have different notions about the sacred, Islam is perhaps the only religion whose adherents are called images. and pictures and figural representations an inferior position in spiritual practice. Now, the first level is the sacred, which I refer to as sacred in essence. The second is the sacred that I refer to as sacred by association. Sacred in essence is to the Almighty Allah. You read Quran, Ayatul Kursi. There is a verse, Quran chapter 2, verse 256. Ayatul Kursi. Allah says, Allahu la ilaha illahu. He is one. There's no other one except him. He is one and he will forever be one. So I said the first one is sacred in essence. The second one is sacred by inference or reference. The third is sacred by association. For an entity to qualify to be sacred in essence, such must derive its essence from itself and must be free of all contingencies and dependencies. Such is the Almighty Allah. For an entity to be referred to as sacred by reference and inference, such must derive its essence and inferential and referential credence from the Quran. I have 5 minutes more. Now, such entities include, interestingly, the Quran. The very first notion of the sacred that Muslims have all over the world is Almighty Allah. Now, by reference, the Quran is also sacred because it refers to itself as sacred. By inference, we also know that the Quran is also sacred. Now, this is a book that refers to itself as honorable, a book that shares the same attributes with the most sacred. Allahu huwal kareem, wal Quran yushiru li nafsihi kal kareem. Aside from that, when reference is made to an entity that may be described as sacred by association, such may include, once again, the hadith tradition. In some texts, Muslims believe that aside from the Quran, the next sacred text close to the Quran is the hadith of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is my argument that hadith texts are sacred not only because their inferential and referential validity are situated in the Quran, but also because they are associated in legal jurisprudential matters to the Quran. Now, sacred by association, it is in this arena that the Dalailul Khairat can be listed. And yesterday we also had presentations on some poems composed by scholars in West Africa that are treated as sacred. So it's the argument of this paper that given these 3 propositions about the sacred, Dalailul Khairat, which is the focus of this study, falls into the 3rd category. And as I was saying the other time, I posed a question ab initio. Why is it that for Muslims, the word is important for us? Aside from the first 2 arguments, suggestions I offered above, the third one is to say that all over the Muslim world, patronage of images, pictures, and figural representations are inferior to the word. Islamic religious law and tradition even makes that a categorical imperative. Paintings and pictures are not usually encouraged in Muslim spiritual practice. The only thing that is allowed for the Muslims to patronize, to celebrate, is the word. Thus, artistic production in the Muslim world has largely focused on the glorification of the word as sacred and the eulogy of the bearer of the word, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as another sacred entity. A huge technology, therefore, has consequently emerged and developed, which is known as Arabic, as you well know. It is around these eclectic analysis of the word and the sacred that my inquiry and analysis of Dalailul Khairat find justification. And as I said ab initio, the very first thing I've done is to ask some scholars in Ibadan and my contacts in University of Legon in Ghana as to what is their basis, what is the reason for their patronage of Dalal Khairat. I have, Rebecca is not here because of time. So far, I've received a number of interesting responses, some of which confirmed the notion some of us had as young students in traditional Arabic schools and colleges. One of it is that Al-Jazuli composed Dalal Khairat based on inspiration. The information at my disposal is to the effect that he went on Khalwa for 40 days. It was after he emerged from the Khalwa that he picked his pen and composed Dalal Khairat. In fact, a colleague was informing me that if there are certain physical challenges a Muslim is confronted today, there are certain chapters in the Dalal Khairat that once he reads them, the problem will be solved. So these are the issues that this paper will be confronting, and I hope I've not wasted your time. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Afis. Right on time. So now we'll move to the next presenter, Jeremy Dell. He's a PhD candidate in history at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests include writing and reading practices in the Western Sahel and the relation to Islamic practice, history of post-slavery, and more recently, visual culture. He's writing a dissertation on textual practices in the Western Sahel across the 20th century based on fieldwork and archival research in Senegal and Mali. Thank you.
I have a PowerPoint, but I promise to engage the public fully. So, hello everyone. Oh, should I just hold the mic? Yeah.
So you can.
Let me begin by, in the tradition of my predecessor speakers, in thanking Dr. Stewart and Dr. Shirakis and expressing how humbling it is to be speaking in this auditorium and at AIC. And I think this will go on record as the largest and most expansive PowerPoint presentation I've ever given. So I don't know however we'll break this record. So thank you. And as I was listening to some of the personal reflections about Professor Hunwick last night, the theme of filial pride seemed to be running throughout the evening and indeed the entire conference, and it made me see my presentation in new light as I was reading over it last night. So, old stand-up career. So, let me begin. It is very difficult for a son to write about his father without expecting to be excessive in his praise. At times, he is accused of exaggeration, so that some even place their forebears beyond human measure. Such being the case, I will try to strip this biography of all filial emotion and speak directly of what I know. So begins Abdul Rahim Dem's biography of his own father, the 20th century Senegalese sheikh and mufassir, Mohamedou Dem. Dem the father was one of at least 3 Senegalese scholars of the first half of the 20th century, whose names are attached to complete verse-by-verse commentaries of the Quran, Tafsir Musalsal. The other 2 were far better known. Indeed, one of them, Sheikh Ibrahim Niass, ranks as one of the preeminent figures of 20th century West African history and is indeed well known to more than a few people in this room. The other, Amadou Dem, no relation, wrote a 20-volume tafsir upon whose completion in 1959 an enormous celebration was held in his hometown, attended by a former French governor, a host of other dignitaries, and even the then Minister of the Interior, Valdiodio Njai. 40 years later, the tafsir was still the subject of public celebration, as shown by this poster. Tafsir sessions were frequent enough and public enough to become the subject of early colonial postcards like this one. Dem's tafsir, on the other hand, received far less fanfare. What distinguished Dem from his better-known counterparts was that his tafsir was executed entirely in Wolof. Two burgeoning fields of scholarship, well represented at this conference, come together in the figure of Muhammadu Dem. The first, of course, is the study of Quranic exegesis, a field that has grown significantly in recent years. The Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, for instance, has published 14 books in the last 12 years through its Quranic Studies series with Oxford University Press. Nor has tafsir escaped the attention of scholars of Africa, as shown by a special issue of the Journal of Quranic Studies, dedicated to Quranic exegesis in African languages, edited by our own Dmitry Bondarev and Tal Tamari. This attention is in part a reflection of the history of scholarly activity within the region itself. As Bruce Hall and Charles Stewart noted in their survey of West African manuscript libraries, the field of tafsir attracted more West African scholars than any other. For whatever reason, scholars in West Africa were more likely to compose tafsir than, say, hadith commentary. Yet the distribution of texts appears to have been highly circumscribed, with few works of tafsir appearing in libraries outside of their home region. Though rooted in a global tradition, tafsir could at times be a highly localized activity. Another important area of study that relates to Muhammadu Dem is, of course, that of Ajami, which, while obviously not limited to tafsir, has important overlap. So my aims in this paper are three. First, I will provide some background on Muhammadu Dem and the transformations that marked the early 20th century in Senegal in which he came of age. The context of his life was, like so many others, deeply rooted in intellectual tradition whose practitioners faced powerful new changes in the era of high imperialism. I will briefly describe some of these changes as they relate to Dem's trajectory before honing in on the text of the tafsir itself. This textual analysis will be partial, and I'll be more concerned with the process of exegesis than with its conclusions. I will end with some provisional thoughts on just what a single tafsir such as Dem's can tell us more broadly about the history of textual practices in Senegal. So as we saw in the biographical note Abdul Rahim wrote for his father, the son was anxious not to undermine his credibility by overstating the significance of the father. If Abdul Rahim isn't completely successful in resisting the temptation to sing the praises of his father, and who really could blame him for that, he does provide some important markers for situating Dem in turn-of-the-century Senegal. Born in 1885 in Kermakala, in the Kayor region of Senegal, Dem's early life was by all appearances largely uneventful. His parents were, quote, of Tukulur origin but Wolof speaking, Tukuluri al-Asl wal-Wolofiyya al-Lahja. His father, Mor Yassin Dem, was a muqaddam in the Tijaniya and traveled to some of the major scholarly centers of Mauritania. His mother, Aminata Ba, was a descendant of Mam Bala Isa, the grandfather of Amadou Bamba. In short, Dem's father was an important Tijani cleric, while his mother's family was closely related to the future founder of the Mouridiyya. As a young man, Muhammadu Dem moved to the village of Gede to study with Bake Bousso, an important cleric in the area and Amadou Bamba's cousin. He began teaching in Bousso's Quran school before situating one of his own, one of his own in the nearby village of Wobe. These villages were all within a few kilometers of Touba, the foundational site of the Mouridiyya, and have long since been absorbed by Touba, by the modern-day city of Touba, which is several 100,000 strong. And again, these years appeared to have been rather uneventful, with Dem's daily life largely removed from the ongoing changes in what had become a French colony. The signal event of Muhammad Dem's life occurred in 1915, when at the age of 30, he abandoned his school in Wobe and moved to Jurbel to settle near Amadou Bamba. And so that red marker is Kër Makalla, which is just to give you a sense of its relation to Touba and Dakar. In Jurbel, Bamba had recently been put under residential surveillance after enduring 2 periods of exile. Jurbel represented quite a shift from the villages of Gede and Wobe, a bustling colonial entrepot with a railroad station completed only a few years before. Jurbel in many ways represented the kind of commercially prosperous city envisioned by French planners. It was a center of colonial administration as well, facilitating tax collection and the surveillance of prominent individuals, Amadou Bamba chief among them. In other words, it was a significant departure from the rural settings that Dem had known. The following year, in 1916, he became a formal disciple of Amadou Bamba and taught in Jurbel until his death 50 years later in 1967. Among his students counted many Murid sheikhs and Senegalese intellectuals, including the renowned scholar Cheikh Anta Diop. Becoming a formal disciple of Amadou Bamba also meant in some sense complicating his relationship with fellow Tijanis. Recall that his father was a Tijani Muqaddam. As always, we must avoid projecting onto historical figures identities that may have only fully crystallized later on. It is not immediately clear, for instance, that in Jurbel in 1916, becoming a disciple of Amadou Bamba meant ipso facto renouncing one's status as a Tijani. Indeed, such a distinction was still in the process of emerging. In other words, being a Murid or a Tijani may have meant something very different in 1916 than it does today. Nevertheless, Dem's move to Jurbel and his allegiance to Bamba did represent a break. Any tension this may have caused is minimized in historical memory, which tends to emphasize a kind of peaceful religious pluralism that present-day leaders in Senegal put forth as both an ideal and as an exceptional historical achievement, in some ways the country's trademark. This emphasis is readily understandable, but from a historical perspective, it can potentially obscure just how disruptive a decision like Dem's could be. He left behind his land, his school, and his students in order to become a disciple himself. This obviously qualified as a major change, and those are rarely free of conflict, but these conflicts were never generalized in a more public way. As a new disciple of Amadou Bamba, Dem set about producing copies of the Quran to give to his sheikh as gifts or hadiyah, completing a hizb every day and therefore a mushaf roughly every 2 months. Under Bamba's supervision, he engaged in Sufi training and eventually reached the stage of fana, or annihilation, a term employed by Abdul Rahim in the biography, but that is, of course, found in other Sufi paths. It is unclear exactly when, but at some point Bamba advised Muhammadu Dem to resume teaching. This he was to do until the final day of his life, when, according again to his son's biography, he passed away at the end of a day of teaching, his final lesson ending with him uttering a verse of Amadou Bamba's poem, Tazawwud as-Sighar. Now, as this last detail makes clear, Dem's biography conforms to many of the common tropes of scholarly biography: the dedicated and austere teacher who is also the ideal disciple. And his undertaking of a complete commentary on the Quran functions in a similar way. It is a common trope in the biographies of Quran commentaries that they can only attempt the feat of tafsir after a lifetime of acquiring knowledge. It is all the more noteworthy then when a particularly precocious scholar transgresses this observance and attempts tafsir at an early age. But that was not Muhammadu Dem. His tafsir was his final accomplishment. Dem's teaching and his tafsir were closely related, for in a very practical sense, his tafsir was a product of the study circle. The process of composition was described to me by one of his sons as follows. Sometime in the 1940s, Dem asked his students to start gathering their notes from his tafsir sessions. These notes were eventually collated into a comprehensive tafsir that became Mawridu al-Dhaman fi Tafsir al-Quran bil-Lugha wal-Afiyya, which I have rendered here as Springs for the Thirsty, a Quranic exegesis. The same son who explained this process to me, Mamour Dem, has childhood memories of students coming to his father with copies of his tafsir, and the group collectively going over the tafsir together, verifying its contents. The process was not dissimilar to what Johan Pedersen described in his 1946 classic, The Arabic Book, which appeared around the same time as Dem's tafsir sessions were taking place, and I quote, "A work was published by being recited and written down in dictation. It only attains its final shape by being read aloud to the author in the presence of the public, and the author gives his authorization to this version." Indeed, Dem's son went so far as to say that his father was not an author at all. He didn't write. He was simply a teacher who taught. The process of composition raises a host of worthy questions that I won't be able to adequately pursue here. One is the extent to which the orthography of Wolof, Wolofal, or Wolof Ajami had become fixed at the time of Dem's tafsir session. If Dem's oral commentary in Wolof was being taken down by his students, were they all transcribing Wolof in the same way? When students came to have copies of Dem's tafsir verified, what exactly was being checked? Obviously the tafsir content itself, but what about the way Wolof was being transcribed? Was some kind of standardization taking place so as to avoid ambiguities? To the issue of orthography, we could also add questions of a more general sort. Is there a particular kind of authority to not only comment on the Quran, but to produce a commentary in Wolof? How are these two moves related? Both are, of course, trying to control the way the Quran is understood, but do they do so in significantly different ways? While devising ways of explaining Quranic concepts in Wolof was clearly at the heart of Dem's work, Abdul Rahim stresses in his introduction to the tafsir that his father did not produce a translation of the Quran, but rather a commentary, and he uses the terms tarjama and tafsir to make this distinction. In conversation, Mamou Dem, completely unprompted by me, also maintained that Mawrid az-Zaman was not a translation. It's further asserted in the introduction that the tafsir was only intended for students who had already attained an advanced level of Quranic study. This raises an interesting question about audience. It is often assumed that Ajami texts are produced for those who are not literate in Arabic. And yet, here we find that the intended readers are those who, in theory, would be most likely to understand the original Arabic text, advanced students in the Islamic sciences. So it might be helpful to explore this question of tarjama and tafsir by looking directly at the text. And we can begin, as the text does, with the Fatiha, which is generally a good litmus test for the kinds of techniques used in the tafsir as a whole. So this will look familiar to many of you, but I'll read it anyways. Surat al-Fatiha al-Kitab Makiyatun Sab'u Ayatin. The Fatiha is a Meccan surah containing 7 verses, and the yellow underline corresponds to the yellow text. And then we have Bismillah. And then we have the Wolof commentary, not translation. And it reads, Chituru Sunyubarom, which is in the name of our Lord, which is almost a word-for-word rendering of Bismillah in Wolof. Moving a few verses down, we have Iyaka na'budu wa iyaka nasta'in. And he writes, Iyaka, Yodal, you alone. Na'budu, lanwijamu, we serve. Wa iyaka, Yodal again, you alone. Nasta'in, lanwi dimbaleko chilip, whose help we seek in everything. And so you'll see also that it is the Wolof commentary that is in fact emboldened on the page, and it is the Quranic text that is a thinner type, and this brings to mind Bamba's a plea for us to use thick ink that Falun Gong raised yesterday. So as we move through the text, we find that much of the tafsir is in fact word-by-word translation, but not all of it. Further down the page, he repeats the Fatiha, but this time with commentary preceding the verses rather than following them. I'll quickly read a few verses to give you a sense of the sound and rhythm. Thank you. Okay. So, yes, here we are. Kham kham sharia lip tabichi iyaka nabudu. Yonu tusawif lip, tabinachi wa iyaka nasta'in. Yonu hakika lip, tabinachi ihdina sirata mustaqim. Tere tarikh yip, tabinachi sirata alladhina anamta alayhim, ghair al-maghduba alayhim, wala ad-dalin. So you hear there's even a kind of rhythm to the commentary, even though it's not presented in verse form. And I can quickly translate. It's kind of a common a Sufi concept that he's getting into here about the Fatiha, al-Kitab, containing all the knowledge and the entirety, synthesizing the Quran. And so basically what I just read was that all the knowledge of Sharia is contained in Iyaka Nabudu. The entire path of Sufism is contained in Iyaka Nasta'in. The entirety of Hakika, real truth, can be found in Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, and that all of the books of history are contained in Sirat al-Lazina Anamta alayhim, Ghair al-Maghdub alayhim, wala ad-Dalin. So, he ends the section of the Fatiha with a running commentary, with no Quranic text. And here I'll condense my remarks. In short, he mentions the importance of the number 12, and how after the Basmala, the letter Mim appears 12 times in the Fatiha. And then he says, quote, "You've seen the two Babs who are here, they understand it being the number 12. Now, anyone who's been to Senegal or even elsewhere in West Africa know that Tubab is the word for white person or European. So here we have Dem making direct reference to the presence of French in the commentary of the Fatiha. But it's not in order to make a political protest, but simply to indicate that even the Tubabs recognize the importance of the number 12. And I assume he was referring to the number of hours on a clock or months in a year. Now, in the introduction to the tafsir, Abdul Rahim states that his father's commentary was based on Tafsir al-Jalalain. Now, I haven't read all of Jalalain, but I think I can say with some confidence that there's no mention of Tubabs anywhere in it. So in that sense, Dem's tafsir was really of its time and place. But with this recourse to Tafsir al-Jalalain, Abdul Rahim placed his father squarely in the tradition of Quranic exegesis, and this tradition was vast. In his book, The Formation of the Classical Tafsir Tradition, Walid Saleh has noted that, quote, "The number of Quranic commentaries is not only impossible to count, but most of these commentaries are voluminous, running to thousands of pages. In contemplating tafsir, one stands before a sea of writing that has been expanding for the last millennium and a half. But for some, even that sea is too limiting. In a now posthumous work, What is Islam? The Importance of Being Islamic, Shahab Ahmed has asked us to distinguish, quote, between tafsir as a formal genre and tafsir as a hermeneutical activity, arguing that for many, if not most Muslims, the most important texts for engaging with the Quran have not been formal tafsir, but literary works. Ahmed mentions Rumi's Masnavi Manavi, which he terms, quote, Quranic exegesis by other means. Dem's tafsir was part of this sea of scholarship. And as only part of a whole, his authority was not exclusive. Without other Wolof tafsirs to form a basis of comparison, we can't argue that Dem's tafsir was representative in content. But I think we can plausibly say that it was representative of the kind of scholarly activity exemplified by the act of commentary that was widespread, if generally unrecorded. And in the world of his tafsir, Dem was authoritative. His Wolof commentary was not transmitted on the basis of named authorities, which are absent from the tafsir itself. Rather, when it came to rendering Quranic concepts into the Wolof language, Dem was the authority. I'm reminded of a phrase from Abdel Fattah Kelitos, the author in his doubles, whose title took on new meaning for me when thinking of Mohammedou Dem's lesson circle. The raw material of language is available to all, but only a few enjoy the capacity to transmute the metal into coin and produce the currency of cultural exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Now, before I move on to our discussion, let me just make a correction about Professor Oladosu. He's not a lecturer, he's a full professor at the University of Ibadan. So we'll have to make that correction. So now let me move on to our discussant. Jawad Qureshi is Assistant Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at the American Islamic College, at this very college. He is a doctoral candidate in Islamic Studies at the University of Chicago's Divinity School. He is currently working on a dissertation that explores debates among 20th century Syrian ulama on issues related to law, ethics, tradition, and politics. His training in the academic study of religion is complemented by years of sustained traditional Islamic studies in America and abroad. Thank you, Dr. Joy.
Okay, is this one on? Okay. All right, thank you all for coming. It's interesting to have a conference honoring John Hunwick. For me, because most people have a relationship to Hunwick's work. Many people seem to have had the opportunity to work with him, mentor under him, and get to know him personally. I came to know about John Hunwick in the late 90s from a friend that was a Nigerian who'd moved to the States, and he was a Yoruba Christian who converted to Islam and was really into trying to dig up his kind of Islamic heritage, which he felt was truly native to him. And he was really gung-ho about his Islam, and he said, this is the book, though, that's going to help me unpack everything. And he had John Hunwick's catalog of Arabic literature, and I was really admiring the fact that somebody actually put together a catalog like that, and the name always stuck with me. Since then, I'd read, of course, Hunwick's work on the Sokoto Caliphate and West African Islam generally. And so, and then knowing that Northwestern has such an interest in the study of Islam in Africa, I've always wanted to come get out of the south side and come up north a little bit to enjoy some of the scholarship there. So I'm really thankful for the opportunity to be a part of something like this. So on behalf of our president of AIC, Dr. Ali Yurtsever, the faculty and the staff, I'd like to express specific thanks to Dr. Charles Stewart for including AIC in this symposium, and I'd also like to thank my panelists for these fascinating papers. By way of discussion, I'd like to think about how we could conceive of these papers together as a whole. And one theme that stood out for me that unites these papers is the notion of the sacred and its dissemination. So starting with the Quran's paper, we consider how Muslims, West African Muslims in particular, relate to the Quran, internalize it, and transmit it to a new generation. The key concepts that animate this paper are the notions of transmission and embodiment. So due attention was paid to bodily forms of internalizing the Quran, recitation, memorization, body rhythms to aid memory, corporal punishment, etc. One way perhaps to think deeper about the phenomenon of Quranic learning among West Africans is to center our focuses on the human sensorium and its vital role in the process of embodiment. So which senses are favored when it comes to Quranic learning? By contrast, we can also ask which senses are favored when it comes to Western learning, which we're all part of. I would like to offer some of my own thoughts on these questions. So think about how you and I read in our daily lives as scholars. We usually get our book, find a quiet, comfortable place that is well lit, and sit quietly and read. This form of reading, I argue, would privilege the eye. The ear and the voice have no real place in it. Further, it's an isolated and isolating form of reading. We read alone, even if we are surrounded by dozens of other people in a library, coffee shop, or public space. By contrast, reading in Quran schools and madrasas generally can be described as oral reading, favoring the recited word and the ear. This form of reading is also social, in that at minimum a teacher and a student are required. Even in situations where one teacher has multiple students, though the students are memorizing their own lesson, the collective buzz of all of those voices reciting at once penetrates into the ear of the student, and it is hard to forget that one is not alone. As Corinne's paper originally describes, Quran learning favors hearing and reciting, i.e. vocalizing, as the primary senses that students employ when internalizing the Quran. The hearing and reciting that they do, of course, is first taken from and then checked against that of a teacher. One cannot hear the Quran or check its recitation from books. Learning even the most basic rules of tajweed and checking one's pronunciation of Arabic letters requires a teacher. The teacher is necessary. This draws our attention to another feature of Quranic learning, the interpersonal mode of transmission. Muslim sources celebrate this mode of transmission as they claim that it is exactly how the Quran came into the phenomenal world. An ijaza that is typically given in Damascus, where I did most of my research, traces the transmission of the Quran from contemporary teachers. So, for example, Sheikh Shukri al-Lahafi, who was a contemporary muqri, jami al-qira'at, who gathered all the various recitations, and it would trace its lineage back through his teachers, through the companion Ubay ibn Ka'b, from the Prophet, from the angel Gabriel, from the Lord of Might, Rabb al-Izzah. The transmission of the Quran thus binds one in a chain of transmission to God Himself. At this point, a question has to be asked as to what sense of self is being thought of and cultivated in the practice of Quran learning. If it's all about embodiment, as is being discussed, as has been laid out, well, what sense of person is being formed? What sense of person is being cultivated? The answer, as Rudolf Ware discussed in his book, The Walking Quran, is a self that is heir to prophetic knowledge. The Prophet's wife, Aisha, was asked once to describe the Prophet, and she said his character was the Quran, and in another instance replied, he was the Quran walking. And so this sense of, if we have practices that involve embodiment, there's a sense, it opens us up to ask this question, well, what sense of person is being formed? How does this person conceive of themselves? And here I would argue that Quranic learning is that it's a practice that tries to cultivate the pious self that is able to receive and carry and transmit the Quran on a prophetic model. There is a notion, though, that was mentioned that the Islamic learning subordinates writing to orality. And I would just qualify that a little bit, that Islamic learning is through and through textual, but it's how the text is engaged, what I talked about in this reading practices that I think needs to be nuanced a little bit here. Texts are always read communally. There's an oral process of reading a text. It's not visual reading where somebody reads on their own. I remember when I was in Syria doing my research, mosques were overflowing oftentimes with teachers reading texts, old classic texts of law and language and what have you, and there was always a book open, but the way in which people engaged the book was communally in the mosque setting and orally through the recitation of a student to the teacher and then the teacher commenting, or through the teacher reciting and commenting themselves. So there is still writing present. The text is still always there, whether it's printed and in hand or it's memorized by the student. So I would just qualify that notion there to say that there's oral reading that occurs. Otherwise, I mean, this is an area of thinking, anthropologically a little bit about Quran learning. It's a really vast area, and I think, this is a great summary of many of the ideas that one can pursue there. So if Corinne's paper dealt with transmitting and internalizing the sacred, then Jeremy's study of Mahmoud Dem's tafsir speaks to disseminating the sacred. Here I'd like to ask Jeremy to speak more about the distinction between translating the Quran and tafsir, this tarjama tafsir distinction that seemed to come up a little bit towards the end of his presentation. There is, of course, the problem that every translation is in some form, in some way or another, a tafsir. But I'm curious as to what the anxiety is that underlines Dem's family's insistence that the Mawrid al-Dham'an is not a translation. I mean, why were they insistent to the fact that this is not a translation, this is a tafsir? Is it simply an issue of prestige, that a translation is somehow less scholarly than tafsir, or is there something more at play? Further, building on the sets of problems, are there in fact other Wolof translations of the Quran? And if so, how does the Mawrid al-Dham'an contrast to those translations? In your presentation, you seem to suggest that the mawrid is largely lexical rather than contextual. But does Dem rely on finding Wolof terms, or is he in fact simply explaining Arabic terms lexicographically, but doing so in Wolof? And then the last question I have related to this is, what audience is this meant for? Is it meant for Tulab al-Ilm, students of sacred knowledge, or is it meant simply for educated Wolof that want to access the Quran in some form or another? Lastly, Dr. Afis's paper spoke then to extending the realm of the sacred. So we have sacred and its transmission, then the sacred and its dissemination, then expanding the concept of the sacred. And here we actually find an interrogation of the idea of the sacred itself. And he provides a useful way of thinking about the sacred, sacred in essence, sacred by inference/reference, and sacred by association. The Quran alone in Islamic thought is constituted as sacred in essence, and strangely enough, it also gives itself that status by referencing itself as being sacred. It's just very self-aware, the Quran. Afis, however, is concerned with the sacred by association, a way of extending the scope of the sacred to other objects. And Afis uses this category, Dr. Afis uses this category to think about the Dalal al-Khairat of Muhammad ibn Sulaiman al-Jazuli as a sacred text amongst West Africans, having a status derivative in some form of the Quran's sacred status. I found the critique of the notion of sacred among social scientists illuminating, but would ask about the utility of employing social scientific conceptions of the sacred for your study, and would argue then that, these notions of the sacred, they reinscribe unwillingly notions of the secular, making a distinction between sacred and profane, that perhaps Islam resists and perhaps Islam even complicates. This is an area that I think is really rich to explore in the ways in which Muslims would conceive of this idea of the sacred and how it would perhaps engage the sacred-profane distinction that we find in the study of religion among anthropologists, historians of religion, and so on. And the related to this then is we kind of had this great setup for, okay, we're going to talk about the Dalal al-Khairat and think about it as this sacred text, and then you ended the paper by noting this is how I'm going to start the rest of the paper. So I'm actually anxious to see how you would expand Jazuli's text or treat it or talk about it as a sacred text. Are you approaching this anthropologically, descriptive of how West African Muslims engage it, or is there some kind of a constructive work that you're trying to imply here as well? So those were my initial observations on these papers, and I'm going to hand it over now. Have some questions.
Thank you. So I think we'll let the presenters address the questions raised by Jawad, and then I'll be walking around with the mic.
Okay, thank you very much for these comments. We were very interesting. Well, I think I don't have a lot of things to add. Yes, just the idea of the prophet was the Quran walking thing. Yes, it's very important, this notion of walking. It means that, yes, there is this mobility, this possibility of this mobility, because it is a body who becomes a Quran, like there is like transubstantiation of the word of the Quran in your blood, and then it's maybe a little blasphematory to say that, but then it becomes a part of you, and so the text is also important, like a reference, like you say in Syria or even everywhere. You've always the Quran, even in Mauritania. And you have also to respect it. You don't put another book on the top, etc. But it's like a reference, like a source. But what is most important, yes, is the incorporation and the orality in the transmission, like you say, which is also very collective and also very. You don't recite the Quran in your head, but you have to do it loud, which is also a very big difference with the Bible, but also sometimes in some monastery also, for example, you've got also this kind of recitation loud, which is very different from for the Christian in the daily life. But the recitation is really important. Also, like you say, the pronunciation, and also the pronunciation of the vowel, so there is no misunderstanding of the text. And maybe it's like, I don't know if I can say that, but for me it's like the text is a little like the body also of God. And if you don't pronounce a word or letter very well, it's just like you do amputation or something. It's just like it's transgressing. You don't respect the God and His word. So yeah, I think it's very important, this concept of embodiment of incorporation. Also, so it makes the text alive. It's not something you don't read, you put in somewhere, but it becomes alive by reciting it and saying the word of Allah and zikr, and pronouncing words in daily life, and also Fatiha for some readings, from rituals, etc. It's always present in daily life, this sacred word also. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I guess you have just one reflection about this paper, and that is to the fact that you were wondering what justification is there for making use of the social science method in the section where I talked about Dohem and Leonberg. The first challenge, one of the challenges that confronted me while putting this together is the seeming, the lack of literature on what we refer to as the Islamic conception of the sacred. In fact, I went to the library, look at Gistol or some other databases. How do you find a text that problematizes the notion of the sacred from within Islam? You understand? Then the second thing, I know that knowledge is, you can't say there is a barrier between the so-called East and West in reference. I read some of these social scientists, and I discovered that they were making use of references from the Bible. Some of them made references to the Quran, but not rigorously. So that led me to that. And as I mentioned, this is a work in progress. So maybe at the end of the day, the renovation will take care of some of the issues you've highlighted. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Yes, the tarjuma tafsir distinction does seem to generate a lot of anxiety, and I think how we understand translation or tarjuma is really at the heart of it. There seems to be an assumption that translation somehow means a complete substitution for the text, the original text, and therefore translation would somehow violate the doctrine of Quranic being I can't even say the word, inimitable. But in fact, on practical terms, translation occurs frequently, and one of the books that explores this most fully, as far as I know, is a book by Travis Zadeh called The Vernacular Quran. Perhaps you know it. That deals with Persian translations of the Quran, but also investigates some of the early juridical debates around translation, and certain scholars that became important in the Hanafi school actually defended translation not only for the purpose of comprehension, but even in ritual contexts as well. But it's an ongoing debate. As for the intended audience of Mawrid al-Zaman, that changed over time. Initially, it was purely within the lesson circles. And as those grew over time, as Jurbel grew over time, as the Muridiyya expanded over time, those circles became more extensive, and people who studied there went and started their own daras. Eventually, in the early 70s, a copy is delivered to a research institute in Dakar. And that's actually how I even found out that it existed. I found it in a research library. And it was only after that discovery that I was able to find print versions of the tafsir. I was made aware of its existence, and I mean, in a way, it was a family project, but it's become associated with the kind of the canon of Murid texts, and I don't know how extensive or how frequently it's read. But I do know that it's gone through. I have the version I was able to consult was the second edition, so it's been printed more than once, and it at one point was purchasable in a store, so you do not actually have to be part of the network of students who would receive it from the source itself. But thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Now we'll give the audience a chance to ask questions. Okay, bye.
Thank you very much for a very insightful panel. The first question is for Jeremy. Bamba had forbidden translations and tafsir of the Quran. According to Murid narratives documented in the Ajami materials in Murid communities, it is very clear that he was very concerned with mistranslations or misuse of the sword verses. Because of the turmoil in the area, he made sure that he didn't want anyone to deal with, to attempt to translate or even tafsir. So that may be an issue, an explanation of why that family was very ambivalent about, acknowledging that that them did it or not. But this is maybe a comment more than a question. Bamba also did not want that those who needed, especially in the formative years of the movement, to receive all the interpretation of sword words, sword verbs, sword verses. So that, especially verse 111, وَيَقْتِلُونَ وَيُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, those verses, particularly those ones. He wanted people with the credentials, okay? And because he has trained Muhammad them, my assumption is that he had authorized him to do that when he was convinced that he had the ethical credentials needed. Second issue that I wanted to raise relates to the comments by Jawad. I think that's a very important one. And that has always fascinated me, and that is the relationship between the oral revelation of the Quran and the tradition of oral learning and chanting traditions of the Sufi, but also the relationship and how they facilitated expansions of Islam in Africa. Because when you interrogate African languages, West African languages will tell you that the key pedagogical channel for us is hearing. If you ask someone in Wolof, do you understand Wolof? Do you speak Wolof? Do you understand what it's the same word? It's dégg nga Wolof. In Pular and Nani Pular, it's the same, but again, understanding is the same as hearing. And so I think that nexus between the oral revelation of the Quran itself, which made the Quran something to be recited, and that expanded into the Sama'a traditions, I think resonated very well and found a fertile ground, so to speak, in many West African countries that in some ways facilitated the expansions of Islam in that region. So I would want to know your comments, if you have comments on these dimensions I call blendings of oral dimensions, blendings of oral pedagogies. Okay. African pedagogies that emphasize hearing and the Islamic pedagogy that's rooted in the original revelations of the Quran.
Okay, I think that was for Jeremy, right?
I understood the initial comments were directed at me regarding the question of translation. And I'll follow up with you on the particulars of the kind of authorizations that was given for this tafsir. I don't know if some of that was also directed at the Dalail. No, okay. But yes, no, obviously, clearly both elements were at play in terms of orality and the kind of visual and textual learning in this kind of context, and even in just the kind of the rendition of the tafsir itself certainly lends itself to kind of a multi-sensorial reading and an engagement with text, and not purely a visual one. So that's an important distinction.
Okay, I think we're running a little bit late, but 2 more questions, one here and then maybe another one, unless you want to stay.
One minute, okay. Can I just also, you mentioned the importance of the hearing, and so which is maybe has influence on the spread of Islam in the world. And I think it's very important, especially in West Africa, this question of also interpersonal relation in the transmission of Islam. You don't have only the book, and so you manage with the book, but there is this personal and dimension, I think, which is really important in the transmission also, and which is still the case today. So, and also just want to mention also it's to talk Quran, if you know Quran, it's ard al-kifaya, so it's an obligation if you know the Quran to teach it, if there is nobody else who can teach it. So there's always this personal dimension which is very important, and also I think also in the spread of Islam, because it's not a distance way of knowledge, but it's very personal transmission.
Recently, I was in a place called Gusau in northern Nigeria, and I observed one thing when I went into this town, saw a madrasa, where children were learning, and they had slates, the same thing that we used to have, which you study the Quran, and after you finish, they clean it, they wipe it for you, and then you have to write a new chapter for you, or a new verse, and you memorize, and then after you finish, then they clean it. Similar to what you were talking about happening in Mauritania, it seemed to be a tradition. But this tradition seemed, and I was fascinated when I saw it because of the fact that I know most madrasa now are moving to just having the actual textual Quran instead of the slate tradition. I would be interested in seeing if there are numbers, in terms of various madrasas that still practice that tradition of, the slate and wipe, and you have to even sometimes drink that verse after it's been cleaned out for you, and then you learn the next one. It facilitated the process of memorization. And I think that is gradually going away. Whether I'm right or wrong, I would like those of you who are aware, because we've left home, so those of you who are aware at home will be able to give me an answer to that. The other funny thing that happened to me, and it was kind of like a joke, but in some extent it's not a joke, coming to this interpretation of what is a sacred. Sacred seems to be relative, because what is sacred to me may not be sacred to somebody else. And what is sacred to me may be something that I venerate and attribute it to such mystical power, and give it venerate it to a religious purpose. And when you look at the Lail al-Khairat, it has been venerated to that level, especially within the West African Muslim tradition. I've never met my wife before. We spoke for over a year and a half before we even met. And this is a woman who so many other people have attempted to marry, wealth and everything, and she's turned them down. So one of the jokes that happened on the day of my wedding was, I found out later that her family members were saying, oh, so he's an imam. Oh, this one is an imam who's reciting Dalail al-Khairat. This is a Dalail al-Khairat imam. That's how I was able to get her. Never saw her before and was able to get her all the way from America. Oh no, this is Dalail al-Khairat working here. So even though it was a joke that was being passed around and we're saying that about me, but it shows the level of the power or the that they associate with the recitation of the Dalail al-Khairat. I had to come clean to my wife and say, I never recited the Dalail al-Khairat. That's not how I got you. You know, but it comes to the interpretation of what I say, the definition of what is sacred may be relative to those to whom that particular aspect is being, this particular phenomenon may be talked about. That's just my comments.
Thank you. My immediate reaction would be to say that one of the things I found out in my brief survey of the notion of the sacred in the social sciences is this assumption that, the sacred is a relative entity. That what is relative to me, what is sacred to me could be profane to you. But when you bring that to what Islam says, the questions about sacred becomes clear. Relativity becomes a nullity. Relativity becomes invalidated once you are talking about the Quranic perspective to it. And that informs that schema that I'm proposing about that which is sacred in itself, that which is sacred by reference or inference, and that which is sacred by association. So I guess from this perspective, the social science perspective will become a nullity. And that is the essence of this panel. How do we engage the sacred from the perspective of the Quran? And I remember, I didn't mention this in the course of my presentation, the notion of the word itself is foregrounded in the Bible. In John 1 verse 1, in the beginning was the word. The word was with God. And God is the word. Social scientists, scholars who have looked at this have come up with a huge literature on the idea of the word from the biblical perspective. So then, with reference to the first question about having a data, for example, on the number of madaris, local Arabic schools still using slates. Once you mentioned this, I remember about a month ago, I was in Katsina for an assignment, where you will find local Arabic schools where the slates are still being used will be in the villages, not in the cities. And a factual enumeration of such schools will be susceptible to questions, because having an accurate data of these schools would involve a huge resource. And I don't know whether that is possible in Mauritania. In Nigeria, the government has done what they call universal basic education, an attempt to bring these local schools to bring them under government supervision. And through that, take away possibly the slate from them and replace the slate with modern day texts which are being used in these schools in the city. Thank you.
Okay, is there anybody else who wanted to add to that? Okay, if not, we had a hand here.
I have a privilege to ask this question. I had two questions, well, more than two questions to Jeremy, and I'll cut it to one, the simplest. The representation, scriptural representation of the tafsir in Wolof is very interesting because it's kind of reverse. You have a bold script for Wolof, and for the Quranic text you have a the same nice hand, but a thinner one. How many of this type of, is it a common feature? How many of this type of relationship between these two texts you find?
I can't really give you a statistical answer, but the thickness of the hand is certainly common, but this is the only Wolof commentary that I'm aware of, so it's the only example of kind of that juxtaposition of an emboldened commentary and then the Quranic text being in a finer line. So that's kind of a pretty direct and simple answer. That might not be terribly satisfying, but that's what I know at this point. So maybe Falun Gong will have some ideas about that, though. I don't know.
Okay, we have 5 more minutes because there's another program here. So one more question.
Thank you for a very intriguing panel. My question is for Professor Fortier. And I was, so I'm a graduate student of Rudolf Ware when he was writing his book about the walking Quran. So I wondered how you conceptualize your own project, sort of building on that research. And one of the issues that I had a constant debate with Professor Ware that I tried to write about in my own book was about the issue of pedagogical adaptation and how perhaps are we fixating or are we fixing these particular practices that have to do with washing the board off, etc., in particular time periods and not really recognizing how they can sort of adapt over time. And that has to do with my own experience in Senegal, learning the Quran in these traditional kutab, which would sometimes be done on the law, yes, but also sometimes done on the notebook. But what was continually emphasized was the idea of, and there was one American that came to study the Quran as well, and he was taking his lessons and going to his room and learning, and the Quran teacher came to me and said, can you like intercede and tell him that he has to come and learn the Quran in my presence, because that's the way that the Prophet learned it from Jibril. Or from the angel Gabriel. And so, and as an example of sort of pedagogical adaptation, I had an interview with a Mauritanian Hafiz Quran, and he said, you know, when I was learning the Quran, we had to come, on our way to the class, we had to pick up goat turds. And once we got into if we had to recite our lesson, if we made a mistake, we had to eat the goat turd. And he said, I got to like the taste of that, but the point being, this is a pedagogical adaptation, which is trying to, but maybe the epistemology or the habitus or whatever that you want to call it remains the same. So I just wanted to get your comments on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, there are many things, but yes, what I've seen in Mauritania, that's there is a kind of ludic transmission for the other text, and the pupils, they can test, the Talmidis, they test each other to know who know, for example, some text, some jurisprudent text, etc., but for together without the master. But for the Quran, yes, the master needs to be there, even for revision of the Quran. And for example, the master don't allow, when there is this laho, the tablet, the wood tablet, they don't allow the pupil going at home and with the tablet to recite by himself, because he wants to always control the process of recitation and revision. And so, yes, the walking Quran, I think you mentioned Rudolf Ware. No? Yes? I get it, yeah. Okay, yes, I know his work. So we've been there in Northwestern in a symposium few years ago. Well, I developed my own work a long time ago, especially in Mauritania, about this, and in French mainly. And then there is also this work, which is very interesting, of Rudolf Ware, which it's the same idea of mobility and embodiment of the Quran. Yeah. So, and also the process of orality, ingestion, and walking Quran, like he conceptualized. So we have the same ideas, and also Louise Brenner has also shown in Mali also the process of ingestion and orality also, which is very important. So I don't know what else. I think About the notebook. Yes, for example, when I was in Egypt, you don't have you have a notebook, and it's different in a way because you can't have this process of ingestion of the ink, etc. But there always the process of knowing by heart and recitation word by word without any thought. So, I mean, even if there is not this process of literally of ingestion, there is still the same process of incorporation by art of the word. So I think it changed a little, but not so much the art of the transmission of this process of transmission of the Quran.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, our presenters, and the discussant will have to end here. Thank you.